Bringing you the top stories from Bonners Ferry to St. Mary's and everywhere in between, this is the North Idaho Prepcast with Ryan Skaggs.
That's right. Welcome into another edition of the North Idaho Prepcast here on IdahoSports.com. I'm Brandon Baney, and now here's the guy who decided to do a computer update right before we were going to record, Ryan Skaggs.
Throw me under the bus. I appreciate that.
Oh, I got to give you a hard time, right?
Yeah, so now I'm forced to record from a phone. So this is awesome and not ideal.
Yeah, it's all right. We're hoping this is just temporary, but just a little behind the scenes, a little inside baseball here at Idaho Sports HQ.
It wouldn't be sports in North Idaho without some sort of technical glitch going on. So
that is so true. There are so many venues up north where it's like, man, do we even get cell coverage out here? Yeah,
seriously. Yeah,
for sure. Well, this is your weekly destination for everything District 1 athletics. We had our debut episode last week, so if you're new to the program, thanks for being with us. There's a couple of ways you can get the North Idaho Prepcast each and every week. And again, this is a breakdown of all those teams that are in District 1. We're going to spend the quality time going over those schools that sometimes get lost in the shuffle when you look at the statewide picture. You can get this podcast by downloading it wherever you download your podcasts. You can also get the audio on our website, IdahoSports.com. We redid the homepage. So across the navigation bar on the top, there's now a Prepcasts tab. If you hover your mouse over that, all of our Prepcasts will appear in a drop-down window. You click North Idaho Prepcast, it'll take you to the landing page, and we've got the player embedded on the web page there. So you can play the audio that way. You can also catch the video on our IdahoSports.com YouTube channel as well as our Facebook page. Ryan, tell me what's on your shirt today.
So I've got a little bit of Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Hank Williams, and Waylon. Some of, if you don't know me, I like my classic country. I'm a connoisseur of the greats. So, yeah, that would be what's on my shirt.
Yeah, that's like retro country. Country today is more like pop, right?
Tractor rap, yeah.
Tractor rap. I haven't heard that one before. That's good. I like that. Yeah.
There's a few newer guys out there that are pretty solid, but for the most part, I'm not a huge fan of modern country music.
Yeah, we'll stick to the classics. And speaking of classics, we are embarking on a classic time of the year. Two-a-days started this week up north. How exciting is that?
I know that I've spoken to a few of my friends that are still in the coaching game that now they've had to bid adieu to their families for the most part for the next 3 or 4 months. And yeah, practice, it's kind of that magical time of year to where luckily the smoke is cleared out up here in North Idaho for the most part this week, so it hasn't been too bad. As far as, we run into, I don't know how it is down southern Idaho, but we run into air quality issues quite often, especially early on in the season. So that hasn't been an issue this week, which has been really nice because I know the years past they've had to start indoors. I believe last year they started inside for the first 2 weeks. So.
Yeah, this time of year, the air quality reports are always so crucial. I know a lot of games got moved inside to the Kibbe Dome last year in Moscow because of poor air quality. So it's nice that they're outside able to practice. We're going to kind of break down the Inland Empire League today, and we'll talk 5A and 4A classifications. Let's start with the 5A. The conversation always has to start with Coeur d'Alene High. I mean, year in, year out, they are so talented, and it appears that they've got the players again to go on a deep run.
Yeah, and they don't necessarily, have to rebuild. They just reload. And, this year is looking much the same. We kind of joke in the notable things of like the absolutes in life is like death taxes, and I guess you can start throwing Coeur d'Alene football in there. Last year they obviously lost in the state semis. They went, 10-1, and one loss was to Rocky Mountain. Which, Rocky was a great team. We saw what they did in the state championship game for 5A. But no, Coeur d'Alene is the favorite to win the IEL 5A this year. Sean Amos brings back, they had some serious, pretty hefty losses from last year's team. But, man, I mean, you're returning 3 all-state players, between Cameron Cope, Gunnar Julio, and Isaiah Griffin that – I mean, I don't know many other teams in the state of Idaho that are doing that, especially at the 5A level. So to return 3 All-State players that are all coming back, and both, I mean, they all had stellar years last year, but that definitely lends well to the cupboards being replenished, I should say, for the 2021 campaign.
Yeah, you mentioned Cameron Cope and Gunnar Julio. They both they saw time as sophomores, which is uncommon for a program like Coeur d'Alene. They saw time at running back and tight end as sophomores, and they're expected to fill those roles this year. Cameron Cope, is a beast at tight end, but he might be better on the defensive line at defensive end. He may be better defensively, and I know that's where he's getting a lot of look from college coaches, is on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, he's a freak athlete. I mean, you talk about being able to have that physicality on the offensive side at tight end. He learned early on, but that definitely replicated on the defensive side of the ball, where he's a handful for anybody. He's too quick for your tackles to handle, and he's too big to block down with a tight end or with a slot receiver. I mean, he just creates headaches off the edge. And I think Ellis at Moscow gets a lot of talk as far as recruits in the state of Idaho, but Cameron Cope's right up there with him as far as the ability on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and of course, Gunnar is going to be he's an acclaimed wrestler. He will be attempting to win 4 state titles over the 4 years of his high school career this winter, and it's kind of his now. The backfield is his. He's kind of split it with Trent Elstad the past couple of seasons, but I'm really excited to see what he does as the bell cow of that offense.
Yeah, and the thing about Gunnar that people don't realize is that he's such a phenomenal receiver too. And he didn't get the majority of touches last year, but still had 700 total yards between receiving and rushing last year. And in a kind of an interesting schedule, obviously the IEL teams scheduled each other to play twice last year. So really kind of, you're like, well, I mean, what was the competition like? But the IEL was I think a little underrated last year. Because Post Falls did graduate a lot of kids too, and Lewiston had a fairly solid program as well. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see what Coeur d'Alene does this year, especially with they got a pretty deep schedule. I mean, they're non-conference games. I would put it up against anybody in the state of Idaho's, with the exception that there's one game in there that's a non-conference against a Washington school that I think you can't have, a bunch of aces every week. You've got to have at least one kind of quote unquote layup in there. But it should be a pretty solid test, at least for the postseason coming up. But
yeah. Let's dive into that schedule. You mentioned it. It is so nice for Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls and Lake City to be able to play those Washington schools again, because without that, it is really hard to fill the schedule. And you mentioned last year when Washington played football in the spring.
Yeah, they only played a 6-game schedule in the spring too. So
yeah, it was a shortened schedule, and so the IEL teams basically said, well, we don't have anybody else to play. I guess we'll just play each other twice. The first one non-conference, the second one conference. That's not ideal, right?
Yeah, and it was all 4A schools played all the 5A schools too, with the exception of Moscow only playing, I believe, a 5-game schedule before the postseason. But yeah, I mean, that was the first time that the 4A teams had played all 3 5A teams, or 4 5A teams as well. So, getting those Spokane and the Washington schools on the schedule. I mean, Coeur d'Alene opens with Lehigh, Utah, going to be at Madison. So they're playing a neutral site game, which should be actually pretty awesome test for the Vikings week 1.
Let's talk about that, because that's at the Rocky Mountain Rumble, which is a showcase event every year, and typically it is the best teams from like East Idaho. Highland is always there, and Pocatello High and Madison, and playing some of the best teams from Utah. Typically is how it's set up. But now all of a sudden you got Coeur d'Alene making the long trip down. I like it. I like them traveling, because at some point they're going to have to travel when the postseason rolls around. So why not have a really early season trip all the way to Rexburg?
Yeah, and it's an awesome facility too. Let's be honest, that the Madison facility is one of the top ones in the state. And actually, I would put it up in the Northwest. It's a phenomenal facility. But Lehigh, has the historical pedigree in the state of Utah that they churn out some top talent. Coeur d'Alene also has their claim to fame too. They've had their number of D1 recruits and athletes come out of Coeur d'Alene High School. So week 1, I think that's a nice kind of litmus test for how the season's going to go. Week 2, they're going to play at Sandpoint. which Sandpoint, I mean, let's be honest, that's one of the coolest fields in the state of Idaho. If you've never been there, it is awesome. Week 3, they're playing West Valley of Spokane. That's the one game I kind of said was, it's a 2A Washington school. They're now in the GSL, which is a Greater Spokane League. Historically, they were one of the better 2A teams in the state of Washington. This year, they're down. I mean, let's be honest, they're not going to be as strong. But I think the week 4 game is the one that's going to be the real test. They're going to travel to North Creek High School, which is in Bothell, Washington. So they're going to be over in the Seattle area playing one of the better 4A teams in Washington. And then they followed up week 5 at Eastern Washington University against Skyview, which is also historically they've been in this, I believe, the semis in the 4A in Washington. I think it was like 5 out of the last 7 years. So Skyview is a very tough program. They're going to make the trek and play over in Cheney, which is pretty cool. They're going to play on the red field there over at Roos Field. Then they have Ferris, which is a Greater Spokane school. And then, which is weird, they're not playing Gonzaga Prep this year. Normally, they've historically played each other every year, and this year they didn't schedule that game. I don't know the reasoning behind that, but then they'll close out at Lake City, then Post Falls and Lewiston. Which that Lewiston game, at the end of the year, always usually has some fireworks. It's like kind of one of those teams. It's like a thorn in Coeur d'Alene's side. Coeur d'Alene's always been able to beat them, but those games usually tend to be a little bit closer than folks usually expect. So that should be a good game at the end of the year, and they're going to be hosting that one at home.
Yeah, and I know Lewiston has put together a pretty solid team. They've got Cruz Hepburn coming back at running back this year.
He's a stud. He is legit. Yeah.
He was, he got injured last year, and I think that really affected Lewiston and what they wanted to do. Okay, so
does Lewiston have Lang coming back at quarterback too?
No, he is gone. He is graduated, but they have Jace McArcher stepping in, and McArcher actually had to play quarterback a little bit last year for Lewiston as well because of injury. So
yeah.
Good 1-2 punch there. Okay, so you mentioned the schedule and the one layup, West Valley. So there's actually 2 West Valley high schools in Washington. The one from Spokane, Lakeland, I believe, is going to play that same week. So the West Valley that Coeur d'Alene is going to play is from Yakima. Does that change your opinion at all on how tough that game will be, or?
No, because the one in Yakima is actually the weaker of the two. It's the one. It's still a layup. But no, yeah, because I thought it was West Valley Spokane, so I apologize on that one because one of the schedules said Spokane, but it's probably wrong. So, okay. No, that doesn't change anything. I still think it's a layup.
It's confusing to us from Idaho that aren't, we don't know that there's 2 West Valleys. Right? Yeah. And they're both playing that same week. Lakeland is playing one and Coeur d'Alene is playing the other. So yeah, I had to do a double take when I was looking at the schedules earlier today. But so you mentioned it. Coeur d'Alene is the favorite in the IEL.
Yep.
Who do you think will give them their biggest challenge?
It's Post Falls graduated a ton of kids. They're second in the league as far as the media poll goes. Pick second to finish, but Post Falls is going to be one. I mean, numbers wise in the school, they usually get quite a few kids turning out. So, I mean, they could be competitive. I really think Lewiston's the sneaky team. I really do. That's the one that could give them a push because of that running game. That's, if McArcher can do well at quarterback, I mean, Lewiston's got some athletes. What their offensive line does is the question mark. I don't really cover that one necessarily as heavily as obviously North Idaho goes, but I think Lewiston could surprise some teams this year. Really do.
Yeah, Post Falls brings back Jackson Anderson at quarterback, but everybody else they lost. That loaded receiving core from last year with Tommy Hauser, who's now playing for the Vandals. James Lee, Cole Rutherford, Josiah Shields, McLeod, the running back. Those guys are all gone, and so that's the big thing. There's a lot of question marks surrounding Post Falls, but
yeah, I mean they do have Zach Clark coming back, who's
right.
One of the better DBs in the state of Idaho, and he will probably play 2 ways this year. But other than that, I mean, Cam Sessions is going to get some time, and that's really there's not a lot there. So it'll be interesting to see, and I hope this motivates them because we'll see them a lot this year on our schedule. But I don't want to sound like I'm dogging on them or anything. But they really do have to rebuild this year.
Yeah, I think along with Lake City, I think also has to rebuild. They lost a really talented senior class. Chris Irvin was a really good quarterback. They do return, I think. I feel confident saying this, the best wide receiver in the league, Zach Johnson, 6'5", and just a monster. I'm not sure if anybody's going to be able to stop him this year just because he's such a big physical specimen.
And the only you really look at it's just the physicality of Isaiah Griffin at Coeur d'Alene, I think, is going to be probably the biggest, and Zach Clark too. He's a good coverage guy. Zach Clark led the state of Idaho in interceptions last year. So, and that's from Post Falls. Those two teams I think can handle him, but Lake City is kind of the big question mark. They're in the midst of a quarterback battle too. So really, they don't even know who's going to be their quarterback week one. We may see the first 3 or 4 weeks them splitting time. And actually, their safety that you talked about is one of the better safeties in the state of Idaho. Josiah Weaver is actually in that quarterback battle. So, it could be interesting to have him going two ways because he is such a good defender. But that's just, kind of, I want to say that the knock in Lake City this year is the depth may not be there. Plus they have the newer coach, but it would be interesting to see them kind of battle. They usually hang around close, and they kind of have those historic games where they will give Post Falls a run for their money once in a while. Lake City's got an interesting schedule to where they're playing, some of the better Washington teams, and if we want to go over schedules again, we can go Post Falls and Lake City too. But yeah, it's going to be it is Coeur d'Alene's league to lose, I would say, just because they have so much coming back on the offensive side of the ball. Defense, they've got a few question marks, but their front seven's really good. But Lake City, yeah, obviously we don't have the info from their coach as far as what their outlook is from their staff, but we can see kind of what they did last year.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you're fine. No.
Well, I was going to say it's a perfect promo for our statewide football previews that we're publishing on IdahoSports.com. We're reaching out to every coach across the state of Idaho and asking them questions about their team, and then writing team previews for every single team across the state. And if you don't see your favorite team on the website yet, keep checking back because we're getting more and more forms back each day. In fact, Brian Fulp, the coach at Lake City, emailed me his team preview form this morning. And so later on today, Lake City fans, your football preview will be up at IdahoSports.com. So
yeah, and I was just actually pulling those up right now. So I have those tabs open. So, but yeah, really, I'm knowing Blaine Bennett at Post Falls, he's not going to tip his hand too much. I think he knows what he has, and he does a great job playing to his strengths, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They're always an offensive juggernaut. You don't really have to question them there. It's really going to be the defensive side. Who on defense in the IEL is going to be able to play against Coeur d'Alene? That's the question mark. That really is at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, we think Coeur d'Alene looks good. I think the league has a chance to get multiple bids to the 5A postseason this year. You could see the second place and even the third place finisher reach because of this new playoff seeding system where they use the max preps rating, with Post Falls and Lake City and Lewiston playing all of these Washington schools. If those Washington schools do well, I think that's really going to boost them above some of those teams that are playing an Idaho only schedule. Do you agree with that, or do you think I'm way out in left field?
No, I think I completely agree. And it definitely helps these leagues with, fewer schools. IEL reaps the benefit, I think, of this max prep system. It hurt them last year a little bit because they, no Washington schools are playing. So, one was a non-league, one was a league scheduled team. So if you're, playing a 2-6 team, it's not going to really help you too much. Yeah. But with Lake City, they're playing at Lakeland to start the year, which Lakeland I think could be. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But then they have at Battleground Washington, so they're going over the west side. Then they host Moses Lake. They've got Moscow at home. They're at Sandpoint, then home against Coeur d'Alene and Lewiston, and then close the year at Post Falls. Lake City's got a solid schedule. that if you're going to look for some of those tweener games that are going to help your max preps rating, they're playing the right schools to do that. Yeah, if you want to interject on that one too, go ahead. Feel free.
No, I think Lake City's schedule looks good, and I think Post Falls' schedule looks good. The big
Post
game
Falls is a meat grinder. Let's be honest. Yeah.
The game I think everybody wants to see is going to be Post Falls traveling to Rigby, and we're going to have that game on IdahoSports.com. I'm going to be there for that one, and so I am so excited for that. That's not right off the bat, but it's very early on in the season. Post Falls at Rigby, the runner-up from a year ago.
Yeah, and that was a great game last year. I went to that game when Rigby played up here, and the ending of that one was phenomenal. I mean, where Post Falls got the ball back with under a minute left, and they had it at like the 40-yard line with a couple chances at the end zone, was a phenomenal ending. I mean, Rigby ended up winning that game, I believe, by 2. So it was a great game. Post Falls, they're going to open it with Sandpoint. We'll have that game. Which is going to be, that's always a good one. It's a fun one to start the year. You get a couple competitive teams. We'll talk about Sandpoint because they're the real deal too. Then they're at Rigby. They host Moses Lake, which in Washington, they're a pretty solid team. They're out there in the Columbia Basin. Then they'll be at Mount Si, which is from North Bend, Washington, but they're going to be playing that game neutral site at Central Washington University, which, neutral site games always bring kind of level the playing field a little bit, I think, but Mount Si is just only having like a 45-minute drive over there, which isn't too bad for them. Then they'll host Lakeland, which I think will be a very competitive game this year. They're at Pasco, which Pasco has historically been one of the weaker teams in the Tri-Cities. But hopefully they're kind of turning things around with the way they've kind of done enrollment in those districts. They're trying to level the playing field because Chihuahua has been the historical juggernaut in Washington in 4A between them, Gonzaga Prep, and Richland. Those 3 teams kind of have dominated the last few years. They're going to be at Lewiston, at Coeur d'Alene, and then home against Lake City. So they close the game with their 3 IEL teams, does Post Falls. That Coeur d'Alene game, I mean, they shocked them a couple of years ago. I mean, who knows what happens this year with Bankston at quarterback? But I mean, Coeur d'Alene's they've got dudes that can run. And it's just a matter of his Post Falls, can they match it with speed? Because it's going to be speed on speed in that game.
Yeah, it's going to be a track meet. That'll be a fun one.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye out on the 5A IEL as the season goes along. The 4A, I think, is going to be even more compelling. It's kind of like the NFC South in football, where like the past 10 seasons, whoever's finished in last place has gone from like worst to first. I mean, with Moscow, Sandpoint, and Lakeland, they're also evenly matched. You can go from the penthouse to the poorhouse and vice versa in one season.
When I was at Lakeland, we had a joke. It was 1-8. You're headed to state, and you only had to beat one of the 2 teams in your conference to go to the playoffs. And you joke around about that, but that's where the Max Preps rating system really benefited Lakeland last year. And Lakeland only had 3 wins on the year, but gosh, of their 5 losses that they had, 4 of them were 1 possession game. I mean, it was a single-digit loss. So. Lakeland, they graduated a couple guys, but not really their key players. I mean, they graduate. Obviously, you lose Ammon Munier, who was a 3-star recruit that's going to Weber State. But and they graduated John White, who was a solid running back, but they returned the other 2 running backs that were in their stable. And then they got, of course, you talked about him in the preview with one of the top 10 receivers in the state of Idaho, and Alden Waddington. That he's 6'5", 200-pound. He's deceptively fast. If you watched the Moscow game last year, you saw him take over in the second half. And with another year for Devin Suko at quarterback, I think he's one of those kids that, he's going to be a junior that's going to get overlooked a little bit because of what Sandpoint returns. Lakeland could be really, really good on offense. I don't know what they're going to be on the defensive side of the ball, but offensively, they can move it. And they showed that last year on anybody. I mean, even Coeur d'Alene, they had, close to 300 yards of total offense.
Yeah, and Sandpoint was interesting last year because early in the season, they hadn't really settled on a quarterback. They had 3 different guys taking reps at quarterback, including all-state running back Garrett Cox. They were basically putting him at quarterback. And about week 4 or 5, they kind of settled in with this sophomore, Parker Pettit. He's going to be a junior now. He's back. Garrett Cox is back for his senior season. And so I think you have to give Sandpoint the early nod, but
For sure.
it's so wide open that they really played well, and they got to the playoffs. And so the way the new Max Prep system works is they seed you 1 through 16 based on this Max Preps rating. However, the top 5 seeds automatically go to the 5 district champions. So Sandpoint, despite having a lower Max Preps rating than about half the field, got the number 4 seed last year as the champs of District 1 and 2. And a lot of people were like, oh, come on, Sandpoint doesn't deserve that. They didn't earn it. I'll tell you what, they got all the way to the semifinals. They were a Final Four team living up to that number 4 seeding, and I think they proved a lot of doubters wrong last year in the postseason.
Well, you look at like I said, with Lakeland and Sandpoint's schedule, they were one of the only 4A teams between Moscow and Lakeland that played multiple 5A schools. And they had to out of necessity because just to fill that schedule. And so, yeah, they took their lumps record-wise. They had some losses, but they were all the 5A teams, and it was much like Lakeland where it was all single-digit losses except for the Coeur d'Alene game. Sandpoint and Lakeland, it was a 6-0 ball game. I mean, in a raging snowstorm. That was crazy, and I was there for that game. And I haven't seen it snow like that up here in quite a while, to where you started the game with a little dusting, and by halftime there was 6 inches of snow on the field.
Yeah.
You put that game on turf, it's a different ball game. It really would have been. I think it would have been kind of an offensive shootout, but it was really who could get it close enough to the end zone before having to punt, to ends up winning the game. But you hit on it with Sandpoint having Cox back and Pettit, who actually, like they said, he didn't start until week 5 last year, and he ended up winning the IEL offensive MVP because of what he did in the last few games of the year. So he's going to be back and be a junior. They've got Newhart coming back as a wide receiver. He's all conference. Hurst on the D-line, Steiger at DB, and Wes Benefield. Wes Benefield is my kind of like player to watch because obviously his brother, we all know about Tag. He was an all-state linebacker last year. So Wes is younger brother, but he's every bit as good. I mean, you kind of watch him on tape, and it's like he's one of those kids that just jumps off. And he was only a sophomore last year, so I think he'll do fairly well this year. I believe he's a sophomore last year. He could have been a junior, but he was playing behind his brother, but was really doing quite well because he was the IEL newcomer of the year. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting test for Sandpoint. They're going to open with Post Falls. They've got Coeur d'Alene. They play at Colville, which is a Washington 2 or 1A school, but historically a very solid program. Which Colville is kind of an interesting game to schedule because they play so similar to Lakeland, historically with the wing T style that Lakeland used to run. Now it's kind of interesting because Colville, I think, is moving a little bit away from that. But then they have the game I think that a lot of people want to see that should be really interesting. They're going to go down to Homedale, which will be a great test. That's going to be in their 4th game. They're going to host Lewiston and Lake City. Then they get Moscow, and then they close the year, which I think will be for the league championship, which is going to be against Lakeland.
So yeah, you mentioned it. Sandpoint, I think, thinks that they have a shot to contend for the title again. They've certainly scheduled that way, and
I think they should. They're returning, 7 kids that were all league.
Yeah. But I agree with you. I think it's going to come down to Sandpoint and Lakeland. Moscow, they lost a lot. Chad Redinger was a really good quarterback. They lost Jonah Ellis. They do have another Ellis that's going to be running around making plays, but Moscow, I think, is just a step behind. But like the 5A IEL, with how the schedules are set up now, playing those Washington schools again, I could easily see all 3 IEL teams made the playoffs last year at the 4A level. I could easily see all 3 teams making the playoffs again this year.
Yeah, and Moscow's the question mark because you don't know who's necessarily going to play quarterback this year. The kid that stepped in for Redinger when he got hurt last year, he did serviceable job. I mean, he played a little bit at the end of that Lakeland game and had a couple of big plays. Obviously, it helps having Ellis on your team that you got that big target out there. But it's going to be interesting, I think, really with Moscow of who came in. And this is the thing about North Idaho that people don't really realize. There's kids that are on the backside of these rosters that we have no idea about because And it adds an interesting wrinkle to it because we have the population growth happening up here in Kootenai County that it's ridiculous how many people are moving in here every week. You've saw it a lot in southern Idaho the last couple of years, but now we're seeing it here in North Idaho. I think there's a few kids that we don't even know about that are like being listed as other players coming in that are going to be probably the MVPs of the league. I mean, I really think it's possible.
Yeah, we know that Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, that area is one of the fastest growing in the entire nation.
Yep.
Is Sandpoint seeing that? And I know I talked yesterday to Garrison Hardy, our District 2 guy, and he said Moscow is really blowing up, as is Lewiston. And so I was curious if Sandpoint, they're a little bit more removed, but are they also seeing that influx?
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, it's Timberlake seeing it. I mean, you're going to see it at the 3A level too. And that, Coeur d'Alene was so hard to move into. People just started buying houses. And so you've got folks moving into Spirit Lake. You got folks moving into Athol. You have, Sagal and Sandpoint and Pend Oreille and Priest River. I mean, everybody's going to reap benefits from this. They're going to start seeing kids coming in. So it should make things interesting because, like I said, we're not going to know until we see him week 1, 2, 3. It's like, where'd this guy come from? He's not even listed on the depth chart. Next thing you know, he's starting and leading the league in rushing or something like that. So,
right.
I think that we're going to see it this year. We're really going to start in the next few years, especially. Post Falls, people don't realize we're kind of talking about the 5A, but they went for like a 4-year stretch where they added an elementary school every year. And so you have all this influx of kids coming in. I mean, you're going to just by, law of averages, you're going to start seeing more athletes coming in too, which is going to be kind of a nice boost, I think, for North Idaho athletics that we haven't necessarily seen. What you usually saw was like you'd lose a couple Coeur d'Alene kids to Spokane. They would go to like Gonzaga Prep. And I'll throw one out there, like the Watsons, that went to Gonzaga Prep. They lived in Coeur d'Alene at one time. So it'll be interesting. I think that, we talk about, there's players to watch, but there's going to be some surprises. There really will.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the point where the IHSAA is very soon going to have to adjust the numbers that define the classifications because.
Oh, absolutely. They have to.
Yeah. I think that's coming sooner rather than later. Well, this was a good start to our football preview. The Inland Empire League 5A and 4A are both going to be must watch every single week. I think, outside of Coeur d'Alene, I think everybody else is really balanced, and it's going to be really fun to see everybody slug it out each week.
Yeah, it's going to be great football, and I'm super excited for our schedule coming up for what we've got to broadcast this year. There's going to be some dynamite games, even at the 2A and 3A level too.
Yeah, stay tuned for that. We are working out the final few wrinkles, and then, we'll have the big announcement on our broadcast schedule for the upcoming season. But don't worry, we got plenty of football on tap for you fans in North Idaho. Ryan Skaggs, as always, it's been fun. We'll hop on next week and maybe smack your computer around a little bit and see if
I think we'll get it fixed. Yeah, I hope so.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this edition of the North Idaho Prepcast. Thanks for listening on IdahoSports.com.